Welcome back to Heads and Tails with me. I'm one of the co-founders at Oppert and Henry Faber, and I feel really lucky and privileged today to have Emma McCrea with me, who's speaking to me all the way from Brighton. Well, not that far. Brighton's pretty close to London, I'd say. Emma is head of curriculum at Oak National Academy that we've all been following very closely, I think, the last few years, leading their provision across, I believe, all subjects and phases. So I can't wait to dig into that a bit more. I think she was previously a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, and Emma specialised in the design and delivery of evidence-informed teacher training for both trainee and experienced teachers. She's a fellow for teacher education, an edtech startup founder, and an author of Making Every Maths Lesson Count. That's the book that I needed as a child, for sure. Emma, welcome to Heads and Tails, and thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Henry.
So you know that we are all about mentorship and mentoring. So I always start with that. I'd love to know your perspectives on mentoring. Have you had a mentor? Do you have one now? Any reflections would be great to hear.
Yeah, mentor, incredibly important. And I love this question. And the reason I love it is that it made me reflect a little bit about where I am at in my career now in terms of mentorship, because I kind of reflected and thought, actually, I'm not sure I have a mentor at the moment. And that role is really important. And actually, it started to make me think, well, maybe I need to fulfill that role at the moment. That said, obviously, I've had really strong mentors in the past. In terms of trying to drill into one, there's a fabulous lady I used to work with. In fact, she was the head of maths in my first ever teaching job, Angela Wright. And she was instrumental really in showing me what great sort of collaborative practice looks like in the classroom and within a team, and what great leaderships looks like as well in terms of leading a department. Because when she moved on in her role, I took her place. And so for many years, in fact, she probably carved out, my thinking around what great looks like, because the first few years of your career are so formative in that sense. So in terms of picking out one, definitely her. There's another few as well, I think, because mentorship plays such a really sort of fundamental role in teacher training. And so I was lucky enough to have a couple of excellent mentors when I trained as well. So definitely helped me in my journey, more probably early career than now. And also something now I've been reflecting on, like what does that look like now? So watch this space, and I'm going to see if I can fill that role.
I really love that. I'm not sure I've had anyone honest enough recently to say, you know what, maybe I need to go find a mentor now. And I kind of feel the same in some ways. So I think it's a classic thing for people to realize, right, that they're in the weeds of what they're doing, and you need to go find that person. They don't always appear by magic.
I think there's a sense maybe that as you progress through your career, you need that less, because maybe you feel like you've got a bit more expertise and experience and that role becomes less important. I think that's probably not true, right? And actually, yeah, like there's always a role for someone to mentor you to continue to develop and grow at any point of your career.
Maybe you need it more. Maybe you need it more. I think that's a nice perspective. The young Emma, the youngest Emma. Let's go back to the school Emma. Maybe there's an anecdote that tells us a little bit about what you were like as a student.
I was one of those very quiet girls that worked very hard attending. So I'm not sure there's too much to say on that. But I do have a really interesting anecdote, because I now work in curriculum. I've focused on curriculum both in teacher training and at school curricula for over a decade now. It's really interesting to reflect on what the curriculum might have looked like when I was at school. And when I was in, it was J2 at the time, it's now year 4. Instead of moving into year 5, I was moved to year 6. So I was put into a class that was a year ahead of my peers. I don't know the reasons for that. I mean, I did attain well, so it might have been that. I don't know whether there was a lack of capacity in my year group for 1 year for some reason. I don't know. But anyway, so I went into year 6 a year early. And in year 6, I did the year 6 curriculum at the time. And then my peers in that class who were a year older than me went to secondary school, and I obviously stayed. And essentially, I repeated year 6. And there was no sense of Emma has learned all this already. I think it was more of a perspective of Emma could cope with this a year early. And then there was kind of no sense of what Emma would do in year 6 other than to repeat that same year. Um, and I obviously became a little bit disengaged and sort of not as enthusiastic about school. And so I remember my mum sort of went to have a chat with the school, and it resulted in some sort of differentiation. So what I would do is I would go to the head's office where I was provided with an A3 art book, and I would draw and copy texts about ducks, which is the most random thing ever. But I to this day remember that experience. And so it's just a really interesting perspective. I obviously know that that doesn't happen these days, and it's fabulous it doesn't. But it's just a really interesting perspective about the role that curriculum plays, and historically how maybe we haven't focused on that in the way that we do now, which is, the fact that we have these rich curriculum decisions and conversations and thinking in the sector is incredible. But it's a really stark example of what happens when you don't think about the curriculum as being like a really important, almost starting point. So I supposedly know a lot about ducks. I can't say that I do, but I should. And so that's just a really interesting anecdote in terms of my experience then and my role now.
So many nice parallels, drawing them together. And if we accelerate forward through the years, you know lots about ducks, but you know lots about education in the sector as well. And I'm sure you've got some battle scars for it. It's not an easy place to work and grow and develop. And have you find it tough at times? Have there been any toughest moments you're happy to share?
I think we have to be honest and acknowledge that teaching is a really, really tough and very rewarding job. I mean, that's one of the things I love about it, is the fact that you can have a terrible day one day and an awesome day the next day, and you never quite know what you're going to get, which, makes it hugely interesting and inspiring for me. I think my toughest moments were early in my career, and that makes sense. I trained a long time ago, and I'm not sure whether I was fully equipped to deal with some of the situations that I faced. When I first started teaching, I had what we would call then a bottom set year 8 class. They struggled to learn. They had low aspirations, not all of them, but they found learning difficult and had decided already not to learn and not to engage rather than to try and fail. And I remember, behavior was also a problem. I remember having to call SLT in on numerous occasions, weekly maybe. I remember that class leaving me in tears. It was really hard. And I know that some teachers leave at that point because they've had a tough entrance into the profession. So yeah, like definitely putting all of you into trying to help pupils and getting very little back, I think probably defines the toughest moments for me in my career. But they were also early when I probably didn't have the best strategies in place to deal with that.
That's a lovely reflection. And amid all that difficult stuff, you've waited through it, you've pushed through, you've stuck. What's been the best result of that, or the best success story of that experience?
So surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, it was actually that class, because I taught that class for 4 years. So I taught them from the beginning of year 8 through to their GCSEs. And that picture changed over those 4 years. Working with the same group of pupils over time is incredibly impactful, because we all know that teacher relationships are really, really important in the classroom, as well as teaching quality. And so this group of reluctant and resistant and exhibiting quite challenging behaviors group of pupils became, even now, my favorite class, which is mad when you think about it. But we all persisted, Me, them, I got them to trust that I was trying to make them work hard because I cared, and because if they did, they would get good outcomes, and good outcomes meant that they had, kind of more doors open to them in the future. And so we slogged for 4 years, um, and they did well. They did better than expected. Some of them got their C's, which were the gold award back then. That was the pitch that they needed to get to. Others did better than expected, but they'd also been on a learning journey in terms of, and I'm not saying the only person was this role for them, but someone who they could see was invested in their future. I think, talking of measures, which isn't the thing, but I think they all on average got 1 grade better than predicted. That opens doors for them. But again, this learning journey of what working hard might look like, I think was more important for both of us, because I saw that working hard with a really tough class actually pays probably more dividends in terms of me kind of looking back and going, what an incredible journey we all went on, me as a teacher, them as learners. And both of us had great success and outcomes from that. And so I think it was also useful that early in my career to see that you could do that. You could, it is hard work on both sides, help these pupils do really well, but also provide a good role model for them in terms of, I'm going to make you work hard. I'm going to push you to work hard. And when you don't, that's have consequences. And when you do, that has consequences. And what consequences do we want here? We want the ones where you get to go on and do whatever you want to do in life, and you've experienced what, someone being invested in your future looks like. And it was incredible. And for them to go from being the worst moments in my career to being, even now, my favorite class, is incredible. And I do, because I'm local, I do see a few of them occasionally, and it is lovely to kind of talk to them. So, and that's the joy of being a teacher right there.
The teacher run-in with the ex-student, I feel like everyone's got good stories about that, from Glastonbury to anywhere else. Yeah. No, I think the lovely result of what you've just said is that your good and your bad experiences don't have to be at odds, and they don't have to be so disparate. They can be one and the same sometimes, and maybe that's what makes them all the more memorable. So I think that's a lovely anecdote. We're always keen to share some content with people. I think people always like some content recommendations. I'd love to know, are you a big reader? Do you listen to podcasts? Do you watch films? Do you read the paper every day? How are you getting your content, and what can you recommend for us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think people are always looking for ways in which they can develop professionally. I can't really say my own book, can I, Henry? I thought, no, I wouldn't.
I think some content channels would call that cheating, but I'm happy to take that as a part B.
But absolutely. Like I was teaching when, back in the noughties, I think we call them. Like I was teaching then when we were still doing things like brain gym. I don't know whether you've come across brain gym, but the old finger thumb, and assessing and then sort of teaching based on learning styles, which both them have no evidence base and no demonstrable impact at all. So I was teaching when teachers didn't have evidence to hand to make decisions and to have insights about what might work in their classroom. So it was literally like finding a needle in a haystack. And now we know that there are ways to point out where those needles are, and there are head starts that allow us to think about what might work, because there's evidence to inform that it has worked. Maybe not in the same context, but it has worked. And so the kind of the rise of the EduBook started sort of around, I think, kind of 2010, and then progressed from there. And that was a wonderful time to be in education, because suddenly we were like, oh, okay, some of these things we've been doing don't work. And there are things that we're not doing that probably will work. And so I think for me, one of the first edu books that was around and that made a difference, a huge transformational difference in the way I taught, or the different strategies that I used, was Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? And so for me, engaging with that made me really reflect upon my practice. And that's what we want, right? We want teachers to be thinking, am I doing what is best for my pupils, both as a group and individuals? And that really sort of set me on a journey of discovery. I think Teach Like a Champion was probably out around the same time, which, talked about naming explicit strategies that you could use in the classroom, which meant that we had a shared language to talk about things that we could do, which was also really powerful. And then obviously other sort of publications and books followed. And so I very much would recommend any of Willingham's work, actually. A great starting point is his first book there. But yes, I'm definitely more of a book person. Do listen to podcasts as well, but I'm a bit old school in the sense that I like to have a book in my hands. I feel like I'm really old saying that.
No, not at all. Not at all. There was a great commentary piece in the Times just earlier this week, actually, I think on Monday, about the value of fiction as well, alongside every other piece of short form content we're obsessing over these days. So I think there's pragmatism mixed with how do we retain the great. And I think edu books definitely fit into that category. So thank you. Last couple of questions for you. This one is around an unpopular opinion. Is there something, it could be educational, it could be something else otherwise, feel free to have broad scope with it, but something you'd stand up behind that you think probably quite a lot of people won't agree with?
I had a little think about some of these questions, so I took it to be in an educational sense. That's probably best, to be fair.
That's probably the right angle.
Yeah, I don't really want to think on the spot about what personal and popular opinions I have. Probably there are some, right? Middle lane drivers on the motorway is probably one. Actually, it's probably not unpopular either, is it? So
no, that's a good one though. That's a good one.
yeah,
I like
absolutely. So educationally, I don't think that I think core practice and controversially in education. I try and make sure I'm really evidence informed, so there's always some rigor around what I do. But historically, there's probably some times when perhaps I've been relying on evidence, and perhaps people around me haven't encountered it quite yet, or haven't had that transformational sort of journey that I went on. And I'm thinking probably when I was in ITT, so when I was training teachers, I very kind of early on, so this is probably about a decade ago now, was contemplating and thinking about the role that having a really explicit curriculum for teacher training would play in terms of the progress that the trainees would make. Teacher training is really hard because you think that you have your cohort for a year, but actually they're in school for most of that time. The academic year is only 9 months. So actually the time that you have to work with these trainees is hugely limited, yet the domain of knowledge that they need to know to be successful teachers is huge. And so, picking your route through that journey and picking what you can and can't teach them at that time is really hard. And so I think I probably made some quite hard, maybe controversial decisions back then in terms of what I thought that looked like. For example, I was very explicit in the way that I taught trainees to teach. So I would, name strategies, get them to practice them before they went anywhere near the classroom. I would make decisions maybe that could be seen as controversial in terms of, what maybe I didn't teach them. So, for example, group work is a really important function in the classroom, but it has to be done really well. And it's really hard to do very well. And so there's a question about, is it valuable to teach trainees strategies that are very hard to deliver, that you kind of need to have some experience and expertise to do well? And so decisions about, what's the starting point? What do they need to know and what don't? And so I suppose, there were elements of perhaps controversial thinking in the sector there in terms of what I thought great teacher training looked like.
It's all contextual and timing, isn't it, as well? It's yeah, things age and change, but I think at the time, as long as you feel like you're doing something which is innovative and can be difficult and different and disruptive, I think nothing unpopular about that, but I like it. That's a lovely answer. Last but not least, we have just about time to snip in a final response. This podcast listened to by people all across the sector, not just teachers. So perhaps a piece of advice for people keen to develop a career in the sector itself, in education. And I think you have a lovely perspective on that as someone who's been in the sector in lots of different types of role and different formats.
Absolutely. Now, I prepared a tip for teachers, so I don't know whether you want me to.
That is fine. No, teachers is
rather than wider. I can come back to you with something wider, I think, that's useful. But I want to give this tip because it is the single most impactful thing I ever did in my teaching. And it is the tiniest, easiest thing to do.
Oh, great. I can't wait.
Tell teachers about this, they go, wow, okay, that's like, I can do that now. And they go away and do it, and they come back and they tell me how great it was. And so, like, I kind of feel like I would do teachers a disservice not to use this opportunity.
Go for it. I'm hanging on your every word.
Yeah. I'm hoping it lives up to expectation now. So it's called the Famous Five. And it is a strategy that helps with some things I was struggling with in my early career, which was starting my lesson promptly, dealing with lateness, and kind of making sure that we got a really positive start that was linked to learning. I taught in quite a tough school in my first role. So there were, pupils coming in late, not ready to learn, not wanting to learn. So the idea is that you would have a do now, or a starter, as it was called at the time, ready for pupils to do either on their desk or on a board, nothing new there. But they would come in, and basically the first 5 pupils who completed that task and completed it well, so not just kind of wrote any old thing down, would go on my board, and they would be called the Famous Five. And, it's also lovely to have positive reasons to put people's names on boards, but they were on the board. And all it was at the end of the lesson, they got to leave first. And I don't mean 5 minutes before everyone else. I literally mean seconds before the rest of the class left. But they loved this because it's like a money can't buy. And for teenagers in particular, it was almost that they left with swagger whilst kind of smirking at the rest of the class. And it even ended up, God forbid I ever left my class go all at once. Someone on the Famous Five would be like, Miss, Famous Five first. You'd be like, oh, sorry, everyone, come back. Famous Five, off you go. And everyone else, off you go. And it's such a simple thing, but the impact it had on lateness, because pupils were like, oh, Miss McGuire, I've got to go and get on the Famous Five. Like the quality of what they did, the fact that we were like learning straight away, it gave me a bit of a space to kind of deal with, any issues in terms of poor behaviors coming in, or, dealing with homework or uniform or whatever it was. And so it's a tiny, tiny thing. But every time I've told teachers about it, they've said that it works in all their classrooms. And I've been reliably informed it works at primary too. So hopefully that's not too narrow for your audience. But
no, it's lovely. And I think you're keeping Enid Blyton alive and well too. I think there's so much lovely there. And on that note, you have to be the Famous Five to be allowed to leave early from your podcast. So you've been a really great guest. I think really rich pedagogy and an experience of teaching that kind of transcends what most people probably experience as a teacher. And I think you've explained it very beautifully. I feel well taught, and Very, very grateful for the time you've shared. And I know this will be a really valuable resource to all those who listen. So, Emma McCrea, thank you so much. And yeah, we look forward to seeing what next with Oak too.
Oh, thanks, Henry. Bye.